This podcast is proudly sponsored by Gyro Drilling. They provide world-class drilling solutions for all types of projects. They specialise in auger, aircore and RC drilling. Head to the team at Gyro Drilling for all your mining needs and see how they can help you with your upcoming project. Hello, I'm Ben Kostrich and this is the Market Bull Podcast. As this podcast grows, every subscriber helps. From those of you who watch this on YouTube or to those that listen on Spotify and Apple, every follower helps. If you do this one favour and hit follow on whatever platform you find us on, I promise I will continue to look and find fascinating people across the world and bring their perspectives to you. Thank you and enjoy this episode. So hello, I'm Ben Kostrich and this is the Market Bull Podcast. Joining me in the studio today is Bronwyn Barnes, the Executive Chair for Indiana Resources, which is listed on the ASX under code IDA. We were just speaking beforehand, she has an insane backstory and history within the mining realm and the people that she's come across and worked for, but welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks, Ben.
You've stepped off the plane. You're sort of a global woman. You're predominantly based out of London, if we were just talking. Yeah. And your story, I sort of jaw dropped a little bit when hearing about the people and the names and what you've done and where you've gotten to now. So can you talk us through a little bit about your history in the mining space before we dive straight into Indiana Resources?
Sure. Look, I think it was almost an accidental entry into mining. It wasn't the sector I was in. I started out in the research and development sector actually because I could speak French, and I was working with a company here in Perth who had a joint venture with Renault, and so I was doing interpreting, translating and documents and all of that kind of stuff. And went off on maternity leave, and as part of my role with the research and development company was a tremendous amount of federal government lobbying, and I was very good at getting federal government grants for research and development. And so while I was on maternity leave, I got a call up from Andrew Forrest to come and run the federal government lobbying campaign for Anaconda Nickel, 25 odd years ago now. And so I started working with Andrew in the early days of Anaconda and Murrin, so I got there about halfway through construction and stayed at Anaconda for about 3 years. And I started, part-time running federal government lobbying, and I ended up as head of corporate affairs. So, look, I think that's where it really started, and that gave me a fantastic grounding. Not only, I already had the government lobbying piece, but then worked through, land access, heritage agreements, native title, media, internal and external communications. So it was a really good grounding for me in a number of those sort of ancillary areas that support ASX-listed mining companies. And then, obviously, when I left Anaconda, I went and worked with Bayu Undan, the project that was being run by ConocoPhillips, which was the Timor Sea the Timor Sea oil and gas project, which was a great experience to work in oil and gas for a while. And then from Conoco, I went to another company called Methanex, which was a Canadian company that was looking to build a downstream methanol processing facility on the Burrup Peninsula. And once again, I was General Manager of Corporate Affairs for them. And then went to Western Mining and was General Manager of Corporate Affairs for Western Australia. And sort of went through the takeover with BHP. So I was on the takeover defence team with Western Mining, and then with BHP integrated then into the Nickel West division, part of the stainless steel materials division of BHP. So I was one of the only women on the executive leadership team that time for BHP. And then I decided that was about 12 years of my career by that stage, and I thought that what I really wanted to do was go back full circle. And I wanted to go back to the beginning, and I wanted to run ASX-listed mining companies, juniors, that were trying to find and develop and, operate small projects or smaller projects. And so that's where it started. So I had about 12 years of running my own companies. I tend to take major shareholding positions in the companies that I sit on the boards of, and that's how I got involved with Indiana. Yeah. It's been a pretty...
Yeah, it's an extensive history and a fair bit of big names that everyone recognises. And I like hearing that, in those big positions like a BHP, you get that sort of itch to go, I want to go back to the start, the infancies of what projects and companies are like. And I mean, that was probably running through your mind, but then selecting and figuring out which projects and which, well, ASX, but how did the Indiana sort of package and organisation or company sort of start forming with yourself as, again, a major shareholder?
Look, I think where it started was the board of Indiana approached me in early 2017 to come on board as chair. They had the Ntaka Hill Nickel Project in Tanzania, and they were looking to move it into a financing and then a development phase. So part of me coming on board was to assist with the financing of the project and give the board some leadership around that. How do you transition from being, an explorer that now has an asset into raising the finance and going into construction and development? And I guess I've got, a long history of working across multiple, African jurisdictions. And so, good experience in dealing with African governments around, transitioning from exploration licences into mining development agreements or concession agreements that are usually ratified by Parliament, which govern, the operatorship and development of the projects. So, look, I'd only been on the board for about, it would be not much more than 2 or 3 months. As part of my appointment, I have a group of shareholders that usually back me into projects. So I'd raised some capital, brought it into Indiana, and we were just finishing the last, a revision of the latest, scoping study to focus on a small high-grade development. And overnight, Tanzania changed the legislation and removed our classification of licence from the mining code. So we had a retention licence. Tanzania changed the mining code and just only had prospecting licences or mining licences.
I think it with any notice, just overnight.
No consultation. It was done literally, rammed through Parliament in Dar es Salaam within 24 hours.
Bloody hell.
So it was quite a stressful experience for the board and for its shareholders. I mean, that was a significant asset. There'd been over $60 million US spent on that project in exploration and development studies over a period of 18 years. The project had always been either held and then, joint ventured out or, whatever, but it had always been held by the company. So that was a significant asset, and it was the only asset the company had.
Yeah.
So a significant asset to lose and a significant loss for shareholders who had invested that money over such a long period of time.
And this is where, I guess, the bulk of the news and the interest is coming from, because over the last year or years for yourself, there's been a lot of updates and, I guess, small wins or potentially down to the big win. But can you talk us through just that whole lineage and history of what's really been unfolding there? Because,
what went on?
Yeah, because it's not an everyday story that at least I get to explore with someone that's lived it and had to deal with the stress of it.
But I think what's really interesting is that whilst, I mean, this has now been going on for, I think this is my 6th year. Of managing the whole expropriation of the asset. But I'm now not the first. I might be still the first, but I think what we're now starting to see is lots of other companies who are having assets expropriated for no apparent reason. The most high profile of which recently has been the loss of First Quantum's asset in Panama. So, this is now not an unusual experience, but 6 years ago it was. So, look, I think, first of all, when the mining code changed, the board, we got the copy of the mining code over the weekend, when it all happened, and we read it, and we really believed that it was an accident. That somebody had just accidentally deleted the whole chapter on retention licences. And it took us a long time to clarify with the government that no, that wasn't the case. It was actually on purpose. It was almost 9 months before the government formally clarified their position on it. And when they formally clarified their position, their position was that they were going to form a mining commission who would liaise with all of the retention licence holders who had lost their assets to agree with them a new form of tenure. So we were like, okay, well, we've got a process, we'll work through the process. So, then I spent about 2 years going backwards and forwards with Tanzania trying to agree a new form of tenure. Now, we've got to remember, during this phase, I was still the non-executive chairman. You know, this wasn't supposed to be my day job.
No.
You know, as in running Indiana, and you know, thankfully we've come full circle and it's now not my day job. But at the time, it just started taking up more and more of my you know, available
chunk of time, yeah.
So look, after about 2 years, in December 2019, I remember very clearly I had a meeting with the Mines Minister in Dar es Salaam, and he told me that we were very close to achieving a solution around resolving the tenure question for Ntaka Hill. He reassured me that I would be very happy with the outcome and that it was a good decision for shareholders and also for the people of Tanzania. And he wouldn't expand on that, wouldn't give me any further detail, but he said, we'll be in touch with you, you know, very shortly. Well, on the 20th of December, I woke up and found on the government website that my asset was advertised for sale. So it was at that point that we then triggered international arbitration. And because the asset was held through an ownership structure that meant the asset in Tanzania was owned by a Tanzanian subsidiary that was wholly owned by a UK subsidiary that then was wholly owned by India, or in partnership with some joint venture partners. It meant that I could take action against Tanzania through the World Bank, through the International Centre for Settlement of Investment Disputes, under the provisos or under the provision of the Tanzania-UK Bilateral Investment Treaty. So that's how I got to the World Bank.
Wow. Yeah, that's not an everyday story at all.
No, it's not an everyday story.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that you have these conversations and then the following morning you see a for sale sign, it sounds like something out of a TV show, just the way that I unfolded. But,
No,
I mean, that was,
not.
December, and now, you know, we had COVID, and I'm sure that was probably used as some form of, you know, delaying excuse, or what was... Surprisingly not?
No, surprisingly it wasn't. I think, you know, that was December 2019. In January 2020, we triggered the international arbitration process, which is this is when lawyers get involved. You know, letters start going backwards and forwards, and then you know that you're in the process.
Yeah.
I remember going to London in February 2020.
Just before. Yeah.
And I was negotiating the litigation funding facility that we had with Litigation Capital Management, which covered us for $4.6 million US, which would fund the whole of us for arbitration. And I think 2 days after I got to London shut down, you know, so that was... that was interesting.
Yeah.
And I was on one of the last flights back into Perth before we shut the borders.
Yeah.
And so, look, I think we continued to work all through COVID. Part of building our case, it took us 12 months to put the case together for arbitration. Having owned the asset for 18 years, we had 496 boxes in archives
of evidence and case studies and just everything that you need.
Yeah, that we had to get out, we had to scan it, send it to London. Our lawyers were based in London. So, no, look, we did work all through COVID. I think that, you know, the final hearing was in the last week of January 2023. So obviously borders were open and everything was back working. But no, COVID didn't really stop us.
Okay. And then, 2023, this is where, again, the news really sort of accelerated again.
Yes.
And I saw one of the investor presentations talking about the resolution without me, I guess, telling what's happening.
Yeah.
Can you talk us through what the sort of verdict has been and, I guess, what's really unfolding, which gives the shareholders quite a bit of excitement, I can imagine.
Yeah, look, I think for the past 5 years it's been a really, it's been a really tough ride until we got to the final hearing. Lots of people, I'm sick of people telling me that I was wasting my time, I was crazy, I was never going to win, that the World Bank wouldn't, support Indiana's case, that Tanzania would win, and I was wasting my time, and basically I was an idiot, and that's fine.
Yeah, well, as you said at the beginning, it was like it's like a child for you. It's like a big part of your life, and it's not easy to just sort of throw that away because people are saying, you shouldn't.
And I was a big shareholder. By this time, I was a big shareholder. I'd worked for 2 years when we had no money. I took all my salary in shares rather than taking it in cash. I've taken every rights issue. I've participated in every placement. I've invested a significant amount of my own money in Indiana because I really believed that I was going to win.
Yeah.
So look, the hearing was it finished in the first week of February 2023. We were really surprised to have such a quick decision, and that came out in, I think it was the 18th of July 2023 from memory, and that decision was, mind blowing. I think I always knew I would win. I was never quite sure how much we would get, but the final decision was $108 million US in compensation for the loss of our sunk costs. And that included our sunk cost interest from the date the asset was expropriated, and then some, a reimbursement of all of our legal costs and things like that. So, look, it was a remarkable decision and really vindicated the confidence that the board had in our case. I think it's, we didn't take this decision lightly to enter international arbitration. When we first sat down in January 2020 and looked at it, so it was pretty much a crisis mode board. At that point, we really assessed with great critics, I guess, of what was the legitimacy of our case. Would we win? If we won, how much would we win? Would we be able to recover that money?
Yeah.
And was it worth our time? And the board at the time, we consulted a number of legal firms. We went to 6 legal firms.
Jeez. Okay, yeah, it wasn't just like, flip a coin, we're doing it. There was a fair bit of due diligence.
Yeah, we went to 6 legal firms who all assessed our case, and then we also were assessed by the lawyers advising the litigation funding company people as well. So we had a very high level of confidence that we would win. Jeez,
it does. It just sort of, from a 6-year period to going through this, I can imagine a very, very stressful period of time. And now sort of seeing the reward of what's unfolding now. I mean, is that all really sort of come to its natural conclusion? I mean, the settlement, is that all really just now
so
the tick of the box?
Here?
Yeah.
Look, Tanzania obviously don't like the decision. Under the ICSID arbitration rules, you can't appeal a decision, so there's no lengthy process here where we go backwards and forwards and there's another 5 years of legal toing and froing. So this is actually international arbitration. It's not law as such. Yeah. So what Tanzania, the only avenue they had was to request an annulment. They have requested an annulment and we're in the process of moving through the annulment phase. Tanzania put forward 4 grounds on which they believed that the case
decision was warranted
should be annulled.
Yeah.
ICSID have already squashed 3 of those 4 grounds.
Oh, far out. Okay.
There's only 1 remaining ground, and the remaining ground, virtually in layman's sort of shorthand, is that that there was a fundamental breach of procedure at the hearing in Washington. So, look, that's the only remaining ground on which Tanzania is seeking annulment. I think the fact that ICSID have said the final hearing to hear that,
that case
will be via Zoom in 26th of July of this year. So Tanzania have to put forward their final sort of submission on their grounds by the 15th of March. We then have an opportunity to respond to that and then the hearings in July. After that, once the decision is handed down, if Tanzania's final remaining ground is thrown out as well, Tanzania has already given a binding commitment to the World Bank that if their annulment request is thrown out, that they will pay the full amount of the award within 45 days of the final decision.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So then that's looking, off the top of my head, end of September-ish?
We can't
you can't really sort of put a nail in
a final timeline on it. But look, my experience with ICSID is that the committees have worked very well. These are obviously independent people who sit on these committees. They've already been pre-qualified by the World Bank. They're usually retired judges or, very experienced legal professionals who put a lot of thought and consideration into the process. I'd like to think that by the end of this year, I'll have $120 million in my bank account.
Yeah.
I mean, that would be an amazing outcome.
Yeah.
What I'd really like to do is have this finished.
Massively.
For me, this has dragged on, for over 6 years. It's been a huge part of my life. And I think this is not why I joined the mining sector.
No.
It wasn't so I could take action against sovereign states. What I really like to do is, build projects.
Yeah, it does. When you talk about the beginning of this, going back and having an interest in wanting to restart projects, you wouldn't have really picked this as the course of outcome. And it's just, from a personal point quickly, I mean, how is this from a psychological, would just staying the course? You said that people were saying, oh, it's not even worth it. And I guess all the naysayers and all the people that would have said that, it can't be done. I mean, how did you just sort of mentalise that and sort of move on with the day-to-day and stay focused on trying to execute this? Because this mustn't have been easy.
I guess I think being a female in mining for a start, you have to have a pretty thick skin.
Yeah.
I really don't care what other people think and say about me. I always sort of say what other people think about me is actually none of my business. So I guess if, when the board sat down in the early days and we all assessed the situation and we had a fundamental belief that this was the correct thing to do on behalf of shareholders. So if I had a fundamental belief that I was right, then I think that's what sustained me.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been a huge mental roller coaster. I don't have a legal background. I now think that I'm a pretty good lay expert.
You've read a fair bit of international legal court and
I think the
systems.
first book I read after we triggered arbitration was somebody gave me a copy of a book that was, a guide to international arbitration.
I can imagine that's a pretty dry read as well from the sounds of it. Wouldn't be one that I'd be taking off the shelf.
I'm fascinated by it.
Well, yeah, I guess you'd be living in the moment and having to sort of be like, this is what's happening. Yeah, far out. And then without sort of thinking ahead for the company, I mean, that'll be a massive sort of realisation of hard work over the period of time. And then
but I think let's remember our original goal was to build a nickel project in Tanzania. Now, at the time, Ntaka Hill was one of the best undeveloped nickel sulfide assets in the world. Now, what's devastating for me is that asset has now been developed by somebody else.
Oh.
Okay, so in October 2020, I went to site. To do a site visit to see if what was the status of the asset. We'd heard rumours that there was some artisanal mining, happening, and there was a possibility that we could have taken the licence back. That was one of the things that we were considering, and we would have been very excited to take the asset back. So we did a site visit. When I got to site, I didn't recognise our site at all. Just driving, as we were driving into the site, the first thing we hit was a boom gate. And it's like...
someone's changed the locks on the house.
Well, we didn't have a boom gate.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah, it's a completely new...
We had an exploration camp. And then, to cut a long story short, what did we find when we got there? Well, I found over 2,000 people engaged in quite sophisticated mining activities. What they'd done was opened up 12 pits across the entirety of the licence, targeting the high-grade zones.
But you guys had sort of done all the work on
that
previously.
They lifted off our ASX releases.
Yeah.
Because they could, GPS them from the coordinates on our ASX releases. And they were basically just targeting the high-grade zones. So the information that I've since then had is that material is running at about 10% nickel sulfide grade, and it's being exported directly out of Dar es Salaam. Wow. So they're trucking it back to Dar and shipping it directly out, and it's going to China.
So, and without putting, do you know who was the party that came involved
and took it?
Chinese
mining company.
Yeah.
They've got it on their website. They talk about it on their website. But the way that they've got around it is that they've done it by applying for 12 different artisanal mining licenses over the asset, all held by different companies, that are in joint venture with a Chinese partner.
Yeah.
And that way they don't have to have a mining development agreement. They don't have to do any community work. There is no environmental regulations. There is no royalties or funds going back to the government from the mining of this asset. So it's all been done completely
under the book and just sort of, far out.
So that was devastating for me.
Yeah.
That was really one of those moments, like when I got to site and saw that, having been to site obviously previously when it was still a pristine sort of licence with an exploration camp where we very carefully managed our environmental footprint and,
doing everything right by the people, the community,
right,
the country.
Shunk, all just absolutely destroyed for no value other than the Chinese company that sat behind the artisanal miners.
Jeez.
So again,
has it sort of killed a bit of your interest and thrive in the mining, seeing this happen?
No,
or is
I'm
it
back in Africa.
Yeah, I was about, hasn't at least dulled your sort of interest in the mining? Because that would be a thing that could ricochet someone to be like, I'm out. I can't do this again. It'd be quite a.
It's not the first time I've worked with or seen artisanal mining in action in Africa. I've seen it in Burkina. I've seen it on some gold licenses that Indiana used to have in Mali as well. So I think that if you're working in Africa, you all accept that there will always be a level of artisanal mining. I also think that if you're well experienced in working in Africa, you also understand how other companies that are not subject to stringent operating and governance standards will operate in other jurisdictions. So no, look, I think really disappointing and soul destroying.
Yeah.
But I'm back in Africa.
You're back at it again. Far out. But if we look at, I guess, what comes next for Indiana Resources, I mean, have you got, again, the mind map of where you go next or what happens with the future potential 6 years that aren't as stressful? I mean, mining exploration, there's always stress, but hopefully not to this level. I mean, what's the next sort of direction that the company's going in?
Look, I think we're really focused at the moment on finishing annulment. We do want to get this whole exercise out of the way. We want to wrap it up. It's not what Indiana was set up to do. I think in the background, which is not really the background, but the focus always goes on to the arbitration. But we do have a magnificent portfolio in South Australia. Our shareholders are very keen to remain working in Australia now. Our Indiana shareholders, they're not that keen on going back to Africa at the minute. So look, we've got 5,700 kilometres in the central Gawler Craton. We've got all the land that adjoins Barton Gold, Petrotherm, Marmota. We've got a magnificent ground position. Those of you who followed the Indiana story over the past couple of years will have seen the preliminary exploration success we've had, particularly at Minos for both gold and rare earths.
Yeah.
We've also got very high potential for base metals in the southern part of our tenement portfolio. We're very keen to get back on the ground and explore. And I guess I've always been very clear to shareholders what happens when we get the money. So, look, I think, we've all put so much money into the company over the past 5 years to keep it going and keep it afloat. We've got a really great group of shareholders who have been so super supportive of me.
Very loyal for these sort of...
Really loyal. They've really stuck the game. What we'd like to do is the majority of funds will be distributed back to shareholders through various mechanisms that the company is considering now. We will be holding roughly 15 million Aussie dollars in the bank to fund exploration activities in South Australia. That will fund us for at least 2 years. And I've always been very clear with the team is that after 2 years and $10 million, if you haven't found something that's worth developing,
move on.
It's time to call it. And then we'll still have $5 million left if we need to go and find another asset, then there's sufficient funds to do that. But on the other hand, if we have found something that's ready to take into some kind of development phase, or feasibility or a scoping or, whatever we choose to do, then that's the opportunity to go back to shareholders and ask them to fund that phase on the merits of the project as it stands.
Yes.
So look, I've always been very clear that money will go back to shareholders, but we will leave enough money in the kitty to
keep
look
the
after
next stages going.
Yeah,
okay. Saying that, you've got base metals, gold at the moment.
Rare
if I look at the
earths.
macro side of it, it's at all-time highs. That's an interesting one.
Yeah.
The rare earths has sort of had a bit of a tough going at the moment, but of course we know the outlook for that. And then who knows? Have you got a potential, priority list, or as you said, because you've got such a large land mass, it's really going to be a matter of what you uncover and then
So
go
I guess
from
we're
there.
really lucky at Minos that what we have is, we'd always been drilling for gold, and it was only when our next door neighbour Petrotherm announced that they'd discovered rare earths that we decided we better go back and test.
Yeah. No, you always like to see other people having success next door and see it. It's
And we weren't really looking for it. We didn't really contemplate having rare earths. So it was only once we reassayed and we realised that, what we had was a zone that sits on top of the gold structure of, so what have we ended up with? Well, we're not quite sure if we've got a gold deposit with a rare earth
on top.
overburden, or do we have a rare earth deposit with a gold credit? I'm not sure. We need to do more drilling.
Okay. Yeah, and as again, this is all the things that are going through your head and the board's head as it sort of gets a little bit further on. But this whole story and this whole international bank, it's not an everyday conversation that I get to have, and I'm glad that, from the way that you're speaking, there is this pretty good conclusion inevitably coming in the end, and it's going to be beneficial for shareholders. Yeah. If there's three key takeaways, I always like to round these conversations out that potential investors and current shareholders can take away from this conversation. What would you say those three key points would be?
About the Indiana story?
Yeah. What they can expect over the next, 12 months?
Oh, look, definitely a resolution to the dispute with Tanzania. I'm pretty comfortable that will be all done and dusted inside 12 months. I think really pivoting that then back to having the company fully focused on exploration in South Australia. I think that, that will give us a great opportunity to get our headspace out of international arbitration back into field work. And then I think finally having a fully funded company.
Yeah.
Show me another junior exploration company that will have $15 million in the bank and a significant tenement package like this who's funded to drill.
Yeah. The market conditions have not been amazing for small cap companies.
Not for a long time.
And we're seeing smaller capital raises along that lines of raising money for a specific project instead of just open the net and see what happens. And for listeners and investors alike that have taken a bit of interest in this story and probably want to keep an eye on how this proceeding unfolds, where can they go to keep an eye on the company news and more so maybe contact yourself and ask questions?
Look, I think, Indiana's done a remarkable job of ASX releases. I think, we've taken extreme effort to keep our shareholders updated on what's happening with arbitration activities. So, look, our website is a treasure trove of ASX releases on international arbitration. And, of course, the most interesting document, I think, on our website is the final award document that was handed down from ICSID that people can read for themselves around. That was the decision that was handed down by the World Bank. That's 120-odd pages or something like that. And, I think it's a fascinating read. I don't know what everybody else will think, but I certainly think it's worth a bottle of red wine and a lazy Saturday evening.
Well, these days I'd end up using AI to sort of synthesise it down to the key points and maybe do it in 10 instead of 120. But thank you so much, Bron, for taking the time to speak on the show. As I said, I've never really gone down this side of a mining company, and it's not an everyday story, but it's good to see that there's a small win, or I shouldn't say small win, a big win on the horizon. So thank you so much. I'm looking forward to seeing what unfolds, and hopefully when you next come back and you can speak on the show, you can give us another update on what's unfolding. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Market Bull podcast. Please remember that the topics and stocks discussed in this podcast are not financial advice. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to like, share and follow. You can follow the Market Bull on all our socials and keep up to date with global market insights.